network all across the 15 counties of the Republic of Liberia. So there's a circuit in Montserrado, which is the first judicial circuit and the sixth judicial circuit, criminal and civil jurisdictions, here in Montserrado County. And all of the other circuits were established as the counties came into being. So you have the second circuit, the third circuit, I want to believe, and I haven't memorized it, so I just give that the literature is there. So the second circuit, I believe, is Grand Bassa, and the third moves on to the next county that was formed, and by extension. So if you find out that the last circuit that we have in Liberia is the one in Bapolu, I believe that would be the 15th judicial circuit, 16th rather judicial circuit, if I'm not wrong. But the point being that circuits, and not about the nomenclature or getting the 16th or 15th right, it's about the network of these courts that are all across these counties, and they have what we term as general jurisdiction over many issues, aside from those that have been put in the place of what we call specialized courts. So beneath the Supreme Court in the legal system, you have what we call the circuit courts. Then beneath the circuit courts, what we have called the specialized courts. Now, specialized courts came into being because there were certain issues that were so recurrent, so disgusting, that we elected that because they keep happening, there should be a single place where we can address them in our legal system. So we create a special court, or as we say, a specialized court to address these particular issues. So we have courts for traffic violations. You hear there's a traffic court, there's a debt court. Apparently Liberians don't pay their debts as they should, so it's recurrent, so we must have a particular court just for debt. There's a juvenile court just to address special issues around children, and so there are many of those things that are there. Now, beneath the specialized court, then we have what we call the magisterial courts. Now, the magisterial courts are the ones that are more commonplace, meaning they are in the communities or closer to the communities, and the gravity of what they handle is lower than all of the other courts previously that we talk about. So if you look at Painesville Town Hall, there's a magisterial court there, Broadville, magisterial court, Garnersville, magisterial court, West Point, magisterial court. And all of these are closely embedded in the community, and they are there to address issues that are lower, but also to create greater access to law. And I believe there also used to be a prevalence of the justice of the peace. To what extent that they are still active now, I don't think they're very active, because the magisterial courts seem to have copied or kind of taking over the jurisdiction. Now, before I conclude on this topic about the legal system, I'd like to point out the fact that we see the Liberian legal system is hierarchical. Hierarchical meaning that you have the magisterial courts at the bottom, and you have the Supreme Courts. The Supreme Court, rather, there are not multiple Supreme Courts, just one at the top. If you are dissatisfied with issues at a magisterial court, you have a right to appeal. There's a time that's allotted to allow you to appeal. Within that time frame, you can appeal. So you appeal beyond a magisterial court, which is a court of no record. You can go further to a circuit. And from a circuit, you can also appeal and go forward to the Supreme Court. That's the whole idea of the hierarchy. At the hierarchy, when you get to the end, which is the Supreme Court, there can be no other process of appeal again. Once the Supreme Court hears a matter, especially in a country that we consider to be a country that respects laws, there can be no other appeal, and the matter ends there. So that's the whole idea of the legal system in which your country operates. Two things you want to take away before we go quickly and look at sources of laws, of Liberian laws from that conversation. The first is that when you have matters that have been taken to the police station for settlement, the police is primarily a first responder. Ultimately, these matters, or any other executive branch of government that interferes or get involved based on their mandate, the matter is only settled by law in the court system. So it moves from there into the court system. And within the court system, starts from top to bottom, you have the Supreme Court, the circuits, specialized court, and the ministerial courts that all make up the legal system, primarily the legal system of the Republic of Liberia. So now, having said that, let's look at sources of Liberian laws. Now, it's important to understand where we get our laws from, meaning how, because the basis for respect for laws is about where we get them from, how they've been introduced, or the book people say promulgated, meaning how they've been expressed in the public space. So, as any serious citizen, it's important to understand where you get your laws from. So, where do we get the Liberian laws from? There are a number of places we get Liberian laws from, and I'll start out by the obvious one. Again, starting from hierarchy. I'll list them, then very quickly run through them before we come to our final conversation. So the first area we get our laws from basically is the Constitution, which is something I believe that every serious citizen is aware of. What is a Constitution? We say the Constitution basically is the organic law of the land. I like to use the example where I say, think about the word constitution and then make it into a verb and call it to constitute. And when you constitute, you put together. And the easiest way for me to define the Constitution is the law that brought together the country, that constituted the country. And that's why you see when we talk about Liberia's independence, we say we're forming 1847. We promulgated or we expressed a constitution in 1847 that created this place called Liberia. And that's why we tend to call that law the organic law, because it is a law that put together the country, that brought the organs of the state together, and that constituted the country. We tend to refer to it also as the highest law in the land, that all other laws cannot violate, must not violate. And if they violate, there's a right to challenge violations of the Constitution on the basis that it is the highest law in the land. The second source of law we have in our jurisdiction are what we call legislation. And it's easy to draw the linkage there. Legislation, legislature. The legislature are the people we elect, we place in authority at the parliament, and we say, go and represent us. Our representatives collectively are the ones we refer to as the legislature. And their primary role, like we spoke about before, when we talk about the legal system, is to make laws, to legislate laws. So, for example, they will pass into law, different legislation creating public entities that they think should be important for the proper functioning of society. They will they will legislate into laws different legislation that have to do with actions in society that need to be curtailed, amongst other things. But the whole idea of legislation as the second source of where we get our laws from in Liberia is the fact that they come from the legislature. It is the legislature collectively who pass both the upper house and the lower house. Beneath the legislature is what we call dedicated legislation. Now, dedicated legislation happens to be, there are instances where the legislature will pass a law creating a public entity. But because the legislature alone cannot just pass all laws, they will delegate or dedicate to that public entity rights to pass certain laws. Examples of those can be, for example, the Morea City Corporation, formed by an act of legislature. Their role to manage affairs within the domain of the city of Monrovia. Now, part of the laws that created the MCC empowers the NCC to manage the city affairs. So in the management of the affairs of the city, they can elect to pass certain things we call ordinances. They will create laws that say you cannot go here at a certain point in time, or you must stay home. I know some of us can recall the first Saturday ordinance that said businesses will not open after 10, businesses must remain closed so that we can clean up our environment. These were ordinances. It's an example of dedicated legislation. Another example of dedicated legislation can be, for example, the National Elections Commission. Now, is an entity of government that came into being by another law. But that law empowers the NEC to also pass regulations. Now, don't be fooled by how these things are called. Whether we call them ordinances, whether we call them regulations, whatsoever, remember our initial definition of law. We said that once it is passed by a controlling authority that can exact sanctions on you for violations, it is law. And it's just a question of semantics that differentiates whether it is not law or not. I assume you follow what we're saying. So therefore, if you look at the National Elections Commission, they are created by another law, but they have the right to pass law. So they can set regulations regarding, for example, when is voter registration. They can agree who qualifies to be a candidate. They can agree how much you will pay. All of those things are things that you must abide by. And you can't argue that, no, you're not a legislature NEC. Why are you making these rules? This is an example of what we call dedicated legislation, and it's a source of law under our jurisdiction. Now, beyond that, we have statutes, and statutes include things that are also passed by the legislature. For example, the penal code, which is another way for saying the punishment code, meaning if you commit a crime, all criminal matters are put forth in the penal code, laid out in the penal code, defined, and punishments associated with violations or of those laws are laid out in the penal code. As an example of a statute, the executive law also are statutes, meaning the laws are created. All of the ministries and entities that the primary ministry and entities that now exist, like foreign affairs, like Ministry of Justice, Ministry of State, all of those are examples of statutes, and they are sources of law also. And then finally, it's important to point out a very key source of law. And this is so important because most times when you hear people attempt to explain law, especially laymen, and in law, when we say laymen, we refer to people who are not schooled or trained as lawyers, but are attempting to explain legal maxims, legal principles, legal documentation, rules, etc., that are legal in nature, but have no formal training or knowledge of the law. We refer to such people as laymen. Now, most of laymen are probably aware of the Constitution. Most of them may be aware of dedicated legislation. Some of them are aware of statutes, they are aware of ordinances, etc. But most are not aware of case law or precedent. And it's important to point that out because in the settlement or the adjudication or the investigation, such that we come to a conclusion, anything that comes before the courts, case law plays a very big role, even more so, most times, than the other laws that we cited, like the Constitution or legislation or dedicated legislation or ordinance. Case law is so huge. So the question then becomes, what is really case law, or what is precedent? In our jurisprudence, we say precedent is about the fact that we are mandated, or courts are mandated, to utilize the same laws they use to address previous cases if they are the same for new cases that appear before them. And in our jurisprudence, the idea is that it is to ensure that there is fairness in how you handle matters. And I'll give you an example. Precedents, right? If two persons fought about a phone and they went to court, and one person said, I paid for the phone, this other person did not pay, but they want to claim it. And a judge reached a decision citing a law that says anyone who pays for this phone is the one who is entitled to have this phone. And that matter was settled, and the person who paid got access to the phone. If a second issue arose that went before that court involving phones and purchases again, that court or that judge is under obligation to look to the previous or the precedent decision and rule in the same way. That's an elementary example of precedence. And that's something that a lot of laymen are not aware of. And precedence is what gives rise to the accumulation of case law. Case law in our jurisdiction is that we don't take the decision of all of the courts very seriously. Yes, we look at some of the decisions of these courts, but we don't take all of them very seriously. But guess who? Which one of them we take seriously? Of course, we take very seriously the decisions of the Supreme Court. Every decision emanating or ruling emanating from the Supreme Court is of very, very, very high value and relevance within the province of lawyers who practice before the courts. Because, like we said before, when the Supreme Court settles a particular matter, it is settled forever. It is settled finally. There can be no appeal. There can be no conversation beyond that ruling that can change that ruling. That is where it ends. This is the decision-making power of a country on earth in a particular jurisdiction that can never be disturbed. So, all of the rulings of the Supreme Court are what we refer to as precedents. They have precedential value, and we refer to them as being collectively as case law. And that's where we get our laws from. So most times, I also refer to case law or precedents as law in action. So the Constitution may give you a law, and the Constitution may say every person is entitled to free expression, meaning you can say anything you want to say. That's the law as written. What is the law in action? The law in action, if it refers to case law, is when someone says something freely, gets arrested, taken to court, ultimately ends up at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yes, the Constitution says that you can speak freely, but these are the limits to which you can speak freely. You can't just speak anyhow. You can speak in a way that you will endanger other people. That ruling of the Supreme Court, which is filed somewhere, and it's always filed, is what we refer to as precedents or case law. And most times, laymen who are not studiers or professionals of the law will only rely on reading what the Constitution says, or reading what the statutes say, or reading what a dedicated legislation may have said, or reading what an ordinance says, but they don't have the time to read opinions of the Supreme Court, which is actually the law in action. And that is why oftentimes it is important to have people who understand case law, who follow rulings of the Supreme Court on major issues, whether these are issues around, say, for example, the code of conduct, whether these are issues around marital rights, whether these are issues around criminal law. All of those foundational rulings of the Supreme Court are what we refer to as case law, and they are a primary source of law. And oftentimes you'll find that when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, they always take great pains to ensure that our ruling are in line with the Constitution. So very seldomly will you find a Supreme Court ruling that is unconstitutional. Most times it is about correcting and aligning decisions of the court in line with the Constitution. So there you have it. What are our sources of law? If there's anything you want to take away from this last conversation, is that one, sources of law, one is the Constitution. As you know, organic law of the land constituted the country, brought the organs of state together. That's why we refer to it as the Constitution. Secondly, we have legislation. These can easily be pitted against the legislature. They make the laws. They are in power. We elect them. They come from all of the different districts across the country. Their primary role is to make laws that fundamentally will benefit the Liberian people. Next, we have statutes, and I talk about the penal code, which is another way of saying the code that punishes criminal conduct, and many other statutes that are there. Example, the executive law, right? These are examples of statutes. Then we have ordinances, and then finally we have case law. I'll start the introductory comment now on the classification of law, and then hopefully we want to have this opportunity now, so if there are people who are following and want to call in and have a few questions on some of the things we said, so that they are able to follow. Let me just confirm what our numbers are for those who want to participate, so you can call in and you'll be able to participate. So if you want to participate on the show, as I conclude on the last session very quickly, you can call in on 0880 514 096, 0880 514 096. I'll repeat, if you want to participate, you can call in on 0880 514 096, 0880 514 096. So having concluded on the Liberian legal system and the sources of Liberian law, I think we already have a caller coming in. Let's take that call. Hello?
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the Phillips Quick. I'm joining Maryland County. Sorry for the bad quality of network on our end.
We can hear you very clearly, Theophilus. Go ahead.
All right, thank you, sir, for providing the basis and knowledge to our people through the radio station this afternoon. You make some significant points. I mean, the pace at which we are talking to make our people understand is really, really important for us because this country, like you said, is governed by law. So every Liberian should have a little clue or as to how the law functions or it works out. But as an individual, I have some observation. Like people who have small money, what do they do? You talk about the first people who should intervene when there is an issue should be the Liberian National Police. Take for example, I owe somebody money. The man does not go to the police station, he goes straight to court. He tells the people, I don't want no delay. And then when the person goes to court, instead of the same law that says there should be probable cause established before arrest, you pay for the warrant, the arrest warrant in the court, they go for the person and they're the put in jail. Sometimes the person just be there 2-3 days, could even carry them back to court to say they're investigating them. So these are simple things that are happening that is really temporary. The corruption we're talking about today begins from the implementer of the laws. So thank you so much. We hope that the justice system, that we have a newer Chief Justice, a vibrant and a brilliant woman and mother. We hope that the justice system can be revamped. We hope that Liberian will stop looking at Liberian National Police. As soon as someone steals your money, someone takes a step, you go straight to court. You don't go to police station. These things are not healthy for us. And then people's rights are being violated because the laws are there. I know you say USD, something like people, all the funds are there. So as soon as person pays the money, they arrest you and put you in jail, keep you there for no time.
Thank you.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah. This is Jay coming here, from Brooklyn.
Go ahead, Dominic.
All right, thank you, Counselor. This is one of your good followers. I want to appreciate the afternoon for the show. I have a few questions I want to ask quickly.
Very quickly, let's get those questions.
Yeah, who is the head of the special court? One. Two, what is the difference in terms of power between the Supreme Court and ECOWAS Court?
I'm following. Let's go.
And lastly, who police refer case to? The court, which court?
Thank you. Very important questions. Very important questions. We'll address them. Let's take another call there, if we have another one. Hello?
Yes, hello?
Yes, you're live on What the Law Says. Do you have a question or comment?
Thanks so much. Let me say good afternoon to Councilor Bala. And in fact, I'll call you from Grand Giga to be precise, where you am following through the Facebook page because ABC is not on. But I just have a few concerns. Like, what is the difference between alien and foreigner? And away from that, as a chair for the Bai Gbala Association, this one, a customer court, there was no case that was heard.
as the president for the Ganja Bar Association, what is his take, especially a term of court that where the case was not held due to the absence of the judge?
Thank you. We'll address your concerns as well. Do we have another caller there? Hello?
Thank you. Let me appreciate you for this platform. My name is Amakos Bondede, and I joined the conversation from the Super 15. Like I indicated on the presentation, this program is actually providing maximum assistance for us, ensuring that we don't understand some of those legal matters. But I'm a little bit concerned with respect to the position you just made in relation to the Supreme Court. The argument is that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of justice. So when they come up with a verdict, it cannot be changed. So in an event wherein there is a review process, can we also conclude that that review process cannot affect the ruling of the Supreme Court? For instance, when they made a specific ruling, they come up with a specific verdict on a specific matter, then they go for a review process. Can that review process affect that specific matter?
Very well noted. We'll respond to that very quickly. Do we have another caller? Let's take at least two more, and then we use 10 minutes to respond to the various views
Hello?
expressed. Yes?
Yeah, my name is Peter Kotapoli. I'm from Bangkok.
Fidel, let's hear your concern.
Yeah, I want to know something about the child that was not the sense of putting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, me and the woman together from born a kid. Based on her attitude and you said if I will some brother between your partner. She carried to court. And the court can explain to you how much you should be paying this girl to feed this child, or the individual can just conclude and just call an amount million. Or the court can ask you which work you're doing, to sustain life. That's my question.
Very important question. We'll respond to that quickly, Fidel. Do we have another caller? Let's take the last caller, then we respond to all of the concerns.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, my name is Kanio. I'm calling from Bogota.
Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I would like to take this time to appreciate your effort in ensuring that people understand the law. Okay, my question has to do with previous to talk about that. Whereas people have a term limit to an appeal. What is that term limit? And if the limit elapses, what next? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, these are very beautiful questions. I wish we had all of the time to respond to those. However, we don't, but we'll try our best to address some of the more pertinent very quickly. I think the first question came from, I don't recall the name, but the question was more around building confidence within the police and the judicial sector. Why is it that people have to pay to ensure that warrants are issued? And I trust you, we've come a long way. I speak as someone within the sector, and things have changed. They are still changing, and they will continue to change and improve gradually. I know that at the police, nowadays, even for the issuance of warrants when you go to the court, you are examined as to the cause that you bring. For example, you don't go to the court and just get a warrant for arrest. If the matter is not criminal, there should be no warrant for arrest issue. It has to be a criminal matter. And whoever prays for the warrant must have listened to you, the prosecutor who's at court must have listened to you and realized that it's a criminal matter before a warrant is issued. It cannot be a civil matter. For example, just because you owe your friend and they go to court, an arrest warrant should not be issued. And I'm proud that most of our prosecutors, government prosecutors nowadays, are seeing that we're not just going to issue warrants just because someone wants to put somebody in jail. No. So things are improving. Are they at the best? Not yet. But gradually, I think it's about building confidence. Dominic asks about the head of the special court. I think he meant the Supreme Court. The current head of the Supreme Court now is Her Honor CNN Yuo, who very recently was nominated, confirmed, and has been put in place at the Supreme Court. Dominic also asks about the powers, the difference between powers of the ECOWAS Court and the Supreme Court. The ECOWAS Court is a regional court, which basically, if you ask me, holds sway in terms of persuasive power based on the ECOWAS region. So normally, all of the countries within ECOWAS are part of the ECOWAS court, and they ascribe to certain tenets of democracy. So when there are human rights violations, ordinarily people will go to the ECOWAS courts beyond the Liberian's jurisdiction to seek some kind of clarity there. But it does not have clear and direct powers of implementation. It must still come back to the Liberian jurisdiction in order for implementation. Whereas the Supreme Court is the ultimate court in the land. Whatever judgment emanates from the Supreme Court must be implemented if we say we are a country of laws. The executive cannot ignore judgments of the Supreme Court. It must implement judgments of the Supreme Court. That is how our democracy has been constructed. Another caller from Zaju asks about who does the police refer cases to. Like we said, cases cannot just linger at the police station. They should not just linger at the police station. Police are first responders. They conduct preliminary investigations. After those investigations, they must forward them to court. People must have their day in court. Police are not judge, they are not jury. They are primarily there to keep the peace. And when they investigate, after the investigation is done, matter must move on to court. If it is civil, if they can broker a peace between those who are involved, fine. If it is criminal, there's no brokering of peace. They must investigate, and the matter must go to court. And the same is of any other executive entity that has any quasi-judicial function. After investigation, matters must all end up in court, except for the army that has a UCMJ, which is a special tribunal just to hear matters between officers of the court. Alien and foreigner. Alien is basically someone who does not have Liberian citizenship, and the same can be said of a foreigner does not have Liberian citizenship. I'm speaking in the context of Liberia. Whereas a citizen is one who has citizenship. Now, that said, there's a process for someone who was not originally a Liberian to become a Liberian. It's a process referred to as naturalization. So don't just assume because someone does not talk like you, speak like you, sound like you, that they're not Liberian. Once they're black and African, there's a pathway called naturalization through which they can become a Liberian citizen. But an alien or foreigner is basically someone who is not a national of your country. In this case, that would be Liberia. Yes, as the Grand Jide Bar Association, we're doing our utmost to engage with our leaders to do the best to ensure that justice is present in the county. And in fact, just today, we were written by the Legislative Caucus to ask us to help with the operationalization of the county council consistent with the law that created the county council. So we are engaged. Will everything happen tomorrow? No, but eventually we hope things can come on stream, and we'll continue to have that conversation. Ahmad talks about the review process regarding the Supreme Court. Ahmad, David, there is no review process beyond the Supreme Court. If a matter goes to a justice in chamber, it is just that justice sitting in chamber. That matter can still be appealed to the full bench of the Supreme Court. So maybe that is a review you refer to, but once it comes to the Supreme Court en banc, as we say, meaning sitting together, all of them, there is no other review process. When they pass a judgment, that is a judgment. And once we endeavor to be a country of laws, if the Supreme Court passes a judgment, we may not like it, but we respect it. I'll give you one example quickly before I conclude. Just recently, and I don't mean like yesterday, but in a few months ago, the U.S. recently passed a law overturning what folks termed before as one of the most progressive laws before, that enabled a woman to determine whether she could keep or abort a pregnancy. They've come back and said, no, a woman shouldn't be able to do that. And there's been an uproar in the whole United States because of this decision of the Supreme Court, which happened a few months ago. But guess what? They are going to respect it. And if they're going to challenge it, they will challenge it through the rule of law. And that's how it's done. So no review process beyond the Supreme Court. Be there child support. the woman does not determine how much you pay. The court is supposed to be an unbiased umpire between you and the woman to sit down, understand how much you make, how many other children you have, what are your earnings, and they will use that to make a determination of what is fair in order to make sure the child survives. Remember, when you have a child, it's no longer about you anymore, my brother. It's about that child. So as long as you can eat, the child must also eat. But the court will make a very fair appreciation of what you earn in order to make that determination. I think we're fast out of time. I wanted to respond. I think there was a last question of appeal. The reason why the court does appeals and limits the appeals is that when you have a matter, we normally say the court will not sua sponte, meaning the court will not act for you when you are supposed to act for yourself. So we set a time limit and say, if you feel you have been aggrieved, act within this time limit. If you don't act within that time limit to perfect your appeal before the court will not hear after that time, because there are many things coming before the court. But I will dwell more on this question of appeal when we return and we start with our next edition. But I think that we're closely rounding up. We have basically 2 minutes to close. At this point, we just like to thank all of our listeners for the very valuable questions. When we return on the next edition of What the Law Says, which will be on next Tuesday at 3 o'clock, we'll revisit some of these issues and we'll have more time to engage with the public. Again, be reminded, What the Law Says is your primary legal platform for education and for legal scholarship here on ELBC 99.9. Bye-bye.